It's NES Works episode 92. Gorsh! This episode sees the beginning of one of the NES's most beloved collaborations, Disney plus Capcom. Well, sort of. Capcom's Disney lineup spanned nearly 5 years of NES history and produced some of the most fondly remembered games ever released for the console. From DUCKTALES to Darkwing Duck, the distinctive combination of the Disney logo with Capcom's dark blue trade dress frame more or less guaranteed a good time. You wouldn't think it to look back at the first ever team-up between the two, however. Mickey Mousecapade lacks the convincing style and forward-thinking design tendencies of Capcom's best Disney games. Probably because this isn't actually a Capcom creation. Despite bearing the Capcom brand, Mickey Mousecapade actually comes to us from none other than Hudson. Now, given that Hudson already has a presence on NES as a publisher, and was in no danger of hitting their quota of individual releases for 1988, it's a little surprising to see this ship out through a different publisher. According to an interview with former Capcom Senior Vice President Joe Morici in David Craddock's Long Live Mortal Kombat, this all boiled down to licensing rights. Hudson had a Disney license for Famicom releases in Japan, but not in America, where the NES rights had been locked down by Capcom. Morici says Capcom kicked off their Disney venture by simply going to the other company and paying a modest fee to license the game code, racking up more than 1 million sales with, as he says, no development costs. Morici appears to be slightly mistaken on that last point, as the NES release does differ somewhat from the Japanese version. Although the two play identically, the American release mostly replaces the original bosses with new characters. To my knowledge, no explanation of these revisions has ever been forthcoming. Given Disney's traditionally heavy hand when it comes to licensing, I have to assume the corporation dictated these alterations themselves, mercurial as they may be. Why replace the thematically appropriate Queen of Hearts with the bizarrely obscure Witch Hazel? Why tap into Country Bear Jamboree at all? These graphical tweaks make no difference to the game itself, so it probably doesn't matter. Mickey Mousecapade originally hails from very early in 1987, and it definitely plays like a Hudson creation built nearly 2 years before the American release, which is to say its design combines elements of both Hudson's Adventure Island and MILON'S Secret Castle, both of which had debuted on Famicom around the same time that this showed up as Mickey Mouse. It's an odd little platformer that almost appears to make a mockery of the 1988 trend of cooperative multiplayer game design. At first glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking Mickey Mousecapade supported 2 players at once. Both Mickey and Minnie Mouse team up here together to share the adventure. But Minnie Mouse is not the player 2 character here. The first and only player controls both Mickey and Minnie simultaneously, with Minnie's actions linked to her companions as she tags along automatically behind him. Her inclusion wavers between liability and asset. Unlike Mickey, enemies can't directly hurt Minnie with their attacks, which means you don't have to worry about maneuvering her out of harm's way. Minnie helps to trivialize a couple of the boss battles. You can separate the 2 mice by getting Minnie hung up on the scenery while Mickey hides, which allows her to bombard bad guys with projectiles without fear of their counterattacks causing harm. On the other hand, Minnie can die if she falls into a bottomless pit, and if she dies, so does Mickey. This makes the second stage of the game the most challenging level by far, as Mickey and Minnie leap over bottomless pits while trying to avoid being swept into the ocean by massive waves in a brutal sequence that I feel almost certainly inspired a similar stage in Capcom's own Ghouls and Ghosts a few years later. Minnie can also be separated from Mickey in a negative way. Certain enemies will abduct her, preventing Mickey from advancing to the next stage until he manages to rescue her. As in MILON'S Secret Castle and Adventure Island, Mickey Mousecapade relies heavily on players uncovering invisible items and decrypting enigmatic game puzzles. The legacy of Tower of DRUAGA, which hit the big time about a year before Mickey Mouse debuted, in action. Stages contain both critical collectible items in the form of keys and power-ups hidden in plain sight via treasure chests, but once you acquire the star projectile, you can reveal invisible secrets by shooting the spot where those items are hidden. This isn't quite as unreasonable as you might expect, as the levels lack the multi-directional scrolling of MILON'S Secret Castle. While moving ahead at a more measured clip, than Adventure Island does. When you strike a space containing a hidden item, sparkles will appear as a clue to keep shooting. Most of what you reveal amounts to bonus items that award points, or collectibles that restore health. You can also reveal invincibility fairies, which appear to come pretty much directly from Adventure Island, and those annoying kidnapper characters who would force you to play a crummy minigame where you have to rescue her by making a random choice. The flow and design of the game vary between stages. Stages 1, 3, and 5, the funhouse, the woods, and the castle, require some exploration and involve a bit of non-linear progression. Stage 2, on the other hand, is a brutal linear gauntlet of environmental and enemy hazards that represented a massive brick wall to kids who ever hoped to progress to the later stages. And Stage 4 is a weird one, consisting of a mere 4 screens inside a pirate ship, but difficult to complete due to its dense layout and vicious enemies, yet more of an interlude than a proper level. Should a child persevere long enough, or an adult use Game Genie Infinite Lives codes to reach the end of the game and defeat Maleficent, what should you find but Alice in Wonderland, waiting to be rescued? Yes, despite the packaging and manual and in-game text making no mention whatsoever of this cameo, Mickey Mousecapade is basically a proto-Kingdom Hearts, in which Mickey and Minnie have to rescue a Disney heroine from a different property by defeating villains from even more properties. There are, however, no Organization 13 characters here, and the plot makes perfect sense, so I'm going to go ahead and give Mickey Mousecapade the nod as the superior work. Anyway, Mickey Mouse on Famicom explicitly called out the presence of Alice, so I couldn't really say why Capcom buried this particular lead. But in any case, it's a nice surprise that I have now spoiled for you. You're welcome. You don't have to play the game. I did not enjoy Mickey Mousecapade when I played it back in the day. In fact, I found it off-putting enough that I never actually touched another Capcom Disney release outside of a brief dalliance with Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers that a friend rented. Like a lot of the games that have shown up on NES Works over the past few episodes, Mickey Mousecapade first hit Famicom in 1987 and didn't show up here until 1988, and it shows. The best NES games of 1988 featured technical advances and design refinements that set them apart from software of the vintage that gave us Mickey Mousecapade, Spy vs. Spy, Mag Max, Adventure Island, and so forth. Even if kids didn't have the critical or technical language to properly explain why these games felt like the works of a previous generation, we could still tell that Mickey Mousecapade lacked the sophistication of a Super Mario Bros. 2 or BIONIC Commando. That's one of the things that makes the NES remarkable, really. You can look back at the library and see console game design making generational leaps every couple of years in a way that simply doesn't and couldn't happen today. That said, looking back in the cold light of retrospection, and with the compression effect of 3 decades passing, Mickey Mousecapade isn't quite as bad as I remember. It's clumsy, and both the brutal second stage gauntlet and the third stage blind guesswork forest maze could use a lot of fine-tuning, but it's a tolerable enough platformer, even though it fails to be the cooperative multiplayer masterpiece you'd expect from a 1988 NES release featuring 2 playable characters. But it's fine. Design-wise, Mickey Mousecapade slots neatly in between Adventure Island and MILON'S Secret Castle, creating a sort of unspoken trilogy of HUDSON releases. Anyway, Mickey Mousecapade would launch the Capcom Disney empire, which turned out to be generally a lot better than this game. And they even redeemed this game's single-player sin with Rescue Rangers. Omnia cum tempore, as Mickey is so fond of saying. Speaking of games that feel heckin' old, Mickey Mousecapade shipped right around the same time as HAL's second and third conversions of classic Atari soft titles. We saw Defender 2 a few months earlier, and it was soon followed by Joust and Millipede. Obviously, these games clearly hailed from a time even before Mickey Mousecapade. Even someone who didn't know the original works from the arcade or a vintage platform like Atari 2600 would have immediately intuited the fact that these were fairly archaic creations. And that's okay. Both Joust and Millipede demonstrate the purity of arcade classics. Short, simple, challenging tests of skill as you race to earn a high score. Like Defender 2, neither game feels quite arcade perfect on a NES, but given the differences in how the NES handled graphics from the original arcade cabinets, and the difference in resolution and pixel proportions involved in the visuals, HAL did about as good a job as you can imagine. And by HAL, of course, I mean HAL programmer and designer Satoru Iwata, who did the heavy lifting here. As you'd expect from an Iwata project, these games feel great to play, even if they don't recreate the coin-op titles with 100% accuracy. Both Joust and Millipede for NES seemingly hail from the spec project that Iwata accepted to assist Nintendo with its failed deal to team up with Atari and distribute the Famicom in America. You can tell by the straightforwardness of these conversions. They don't add any embellishments or modernizations to the design of either game, but mostly by the fact that they use the same title screen jingle as Defender 2 and somehow Punch-Out! Of the two, I'd say Millipede fares better. This sequel to Centipede ratcheted up the intensity of the action impressively, throwing way more at the player at any given time. I personally preferred the focused simplicity of Centipede, but there's something to be said for the sensory overload of Millipede. Multiple things happen on-screen during every moment of the game, distracting you from your central objective of blowing up a multi-segmented arthropod that splits into smaller, more elusive pieces with every successful hit you land. At its core, Millipede combines the basic concepts of asteroids with Space Invaders. The eponymous enemy advances laterally and downward, like the invaders, but it fragments and becomes more dangerous as you shoot it, as an asteroid. Then it adds its own inventions to the mix. The Millipede shifts down a line anytime it hits one of the mushrooms randomly strewn around the screen. A spider leaps across the bottom of the screen, moving unpredictably within a defined pattern. Fleas plummet from above, while a slug occasionally makes its way across the upper end of the screen, both creatures leaving behind trails of mushrooms that create additional barriers in the playing field. All of these elements existed in Centipede, but Millipede adds even more to them. Now as many as 3 spiders can appear at a time, moving around in a swarm of chaos. Mushrooms spring up more quickly, eventually growing so dense that the game has to reset the field every few stages. New bug types appear, with more erratic and dangerous patterns of movement. Meanwhile, the only new ace up your sleeve is the ability to blast the DDT bombs scattered around the field, Millipede having been designed before the mid-80s crackdown on toxic pesticides. These explode and take out any creature in the blast radius. Somehow, the NES manages to recreate it all, the only real drawback here being that you have to control your on-screen avatar with a D-pad rather than the arcade machine's highly responsive analog trackball. But that was true for most of this game's home ports, and the NES adaptation acquits itself well. So too does the NES version of Joust. Unfortunately for HAL, the ultimate home conversion of Joust had already shipped 2 years earlier, the Atari 7800 version. The NES port controls and moves more faithfully to the arcade machine with lots of inertia and a challenging sluggishness, while in contrast the 7800 version controlled more responsively and moved faster, making for an exciting and challenging adaptation. At the same time, the 7800 version looked more authentic to the arcade system, whereas the NES's pixel proportions make it chunkier and a little clumsier. Still, HAL nailed the arcade game, allowing 2 players to team up and fight horrible knights on buzzards by lancing them in midair from the backs of ostrich mounts. It's weird, but it works. A higher lance in a clash between flyers scores a hit, and a defeated knight's mount drops an egg as it flutters away, which can hatch anew into a replacement knight if you don't crush the egg in time. Players fly by pumping the flight button, but maintaining a higher altitude than enemy flyers poses a challenge. If you don't tap the flight button fast enough, you'll drop. But if you pump too hard, you'll smack into an overhead barrier or platform and rebound forcefully to a lower altitude. Even if HAL's version doesn't quite hold up to General Computing Corp's take on the game, it's still solid. And not to kick a failed platform while it's down, but how many people had realistically played the 7800 release at this point? Joust and Millipede both make fine additions to the NES's modest but capable library of vintage arcade games. And hey, the work Iwata did here on Joust made both Balloon Fight and Super Mario so good. And speaking of both arcade classics and Mario, we end this episode with the return of Donkey Kong, but not the return of Donkey Kong. One of the most vexing line items in Nintendo's early NES literature was a blurb in the official NES Player's Guide teasing a game called The Return of Donkey Kong, which purported to put players in control of the gorilla for the first time ever. That game never materialized, and no concrete information has ever emerged from Nintendo's darkest depths to explain what it might have been. Instead, we received Donkey Kong Classics, which is simply a compilation of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. And yes, only those 2 games. Evidently, Donkey Kong 3 does not constitute a classic. Harsh. along with the Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt cartridge that shipped around this time as a pack-in with some models of the NES hardware. DK Classics was the first of Nintendo's multi-cart releases to cram small, older games onto more capacious modern cartridges, usually with minimal changes. As a matter of fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find any changes here. The DK Classics cartridge contains the two Famicom launch games unadulterated, with the only new addition being a new title screen that allows you to launch into either of the selections it contains. Nintendo simply took two existing ROMs and stuffed them onto a chip powered by a mapper that allowed the console to load one title or the other into memory. Their approach didn't actually require a high-end chip like the MMC-1 that powered Zelda, or the new MMC-3 that would debut in the NES with Super Mario Bros. 2. Donkey Kong Classics uses a CN-ROM chip, which powered a lot of games that originated in 1986 and 87, including Gradius and Mickey Mousecapade. The CN-ROM more or less amounts to a beefier version of the N-ROM carts that powered the original Kong releases. It offers more or less the same capabilities, but can contain up to 4 times as much storage space. Of course, this makes Donkey Kong 3's omission all the more brutal. DK Classics literally left half its potential storage banks empty. Nintendo could easily have fit Donkey Kong 3 in here and thrown in Mario Bros. As well for good measure. But no, it's just Kong and Kong Jr. carried forward with no improvements or enhancements. At the very least, this could have been an opportunity for Nintendo to rectify the fact that Donkey Kong for NES did not include the Cement Factory stage, but no. I have to assume the fact that DK Classics only shipped in the US and Europe meant that it wasn't a real Nintendo product, and therefore did not enjoy the blessing of the company's actual development staff, even acknowledging its existence. Honestly, Donkey Kong Classics probably only exists as a way to freshen up these games' packaging in the US and Europe, and to keep them in circulation without looking dated at retail. The last black box game had shipped a full year before DK Classics. Rad Racer, which actually shipped in a silver box, and the iconic trade dress at this point spoke of a bygone era that the NES had surpassed. But as two of the most popular arcade games of all time, the original Kong titles still had appeal and value, so it behooved Nintendo to update their look, or at least their look on store shelves anyway. So the two games appear in a single cartridge wrapped in a brilliant orange box that calls back to the original Donkey Kong Jr.'s cabinet. The design elements on the box retain the general black box arrangement, but the brighter colors and curiously off-model cartoon illustration of this package offer a clean break from those games' aging original packaging. Oh, and there was probably another incentive for Nintendo to refresh the Donkey Kong games, as we'll see in an upcoming episode of NES Works Guide In.